The soft hum of the fridge in the kitchen was the only sound that broke the silence in my house that evening. It wasn't the stillness of calm, but the type of silence that was so heavy with unspoken words and unaddressed tension that it felt suffocating. I had never imagined that asking for help could feel so much like betrayal. But there I was, standing in my own living room, staring at my sister's family, my request for assistance hanging in the air between us like an insurmountable wall. For 5 long years, they had lived in my house, rent-free, as my sister's family sought refuge after a string of personal misfortunes. I didn't mind, not at first. After all, they were family, and helping them seemed like the right thing to do. They needed a place to stay, and I had the space. But time, it seems, has a way of turning generosity into expectation, and over the years, that thin line between helping out and being taken for granted had become blurred. I had never asked for anything in return, not even when I needed it. But now, as my health deteriorated and medical bills piled up, I found myself at a breaking point. All I needed was a little help, a small contribution toward my mounting medical expenses. It was a simple request, one that seemed fair considering everything I had done for them. But when I finally found the courage to ask, I was met with silence, then deflection, then a coldness that shook me to my core. I never thought it would come to this. I thought family was supposed to have your back, no matter what. Yet in that moment, as I stood there, waiting for a response that would never come, I realized that sometimes, even the closest of relationships can fracture when you least expect it. It had always been clear to me that family was supposed to be a pillar of support. Growing up, my sister and I shared everything: clothes, secrets, even our dreams of the future. We had our differences, of course, but the bond between us was unshakable. Or at least, that's what I had believed. When she and her family first moved into my house 5 years ago, I saw it as an opportunity to do something good for those I loved. At the time, they had been going through a tough period. My sister had just gone through a painful divorce, and her job wasn't enough to keep up with the rent. I didn't hesitate. My house was large, with plenty of rooms that were going unused. It felt like the right thing to do, and I was more than happy to help them out. But what I didn't realize was how easy it would be for the lines between family and obligation to become blurred. In the beginning, everything was fine. We all pitched in when it came to household chores, and the kids were delightful. They were still young enough to find joy in everything they did, running around the yard and laughing, their innocence almost contagious. My sister, too, seemed grateful for the space, and though it wasn't ideal, we made it work. But as the months turned into years, I began to notice the cracks forming. My sister didn't seem as appreciative as I had hoped. There were small things at first: her constant requests for more room in the fridge, her tendency to leave dishes undone in the sink, the way she never seemed to acknowledge the effort it took to maintain the house. Still, I brushed it off. I told myself I was being unreasonable, expecting too much. After all, they were going through their own struggles. I had a stable life, and helping them out should have been enough. But soon, the subtle resentments started building up. I didn't mind being the one who had to do most of the work, but over time, I began to feel invisible in my own home. My sister didn't seem to notice when I was tired, when I was frustrated, or when I needed a moment of peace. She had become so accustomed to the safety net I had created for her that she no longer saw me as a sister, but as someone who was always there to take care of things. The kids were growing older, and with that came more demands. They were at the age where they needed things: new shoes, school supplies, extracurricular activities, and my sister didn't hesitate to ask for help with all of it. I never said no, of course. It wasn't in my nature to refuse family, but there was always a nagging feeling in the back of my mind that something wasn't right. The tension between us wasn't always visible. On the surface, everything appeared normal. My sister and I would still have our chats over coffee, laugh at the kids' antics, and share family stories. But beneath it all, I could feel the weight of the years pressing down on me. Every time I did something for her, I was reminded that she had never really asked if I was okay. And the longer she stayed, the more I began to question whether she was truly grateful or if she had simply come to rely on my generosity. The first real crack in our relationship came a year ago. I had been feeling increasingly exhausted, physically and emotionally. I was dealing with health issues that I had kept hidden for a while, trying to maintain a sense of normalcy. But eventually, it became impossible to ignore. I had been to several doctors and had run up a mountain of medical bills. The treatments were costly, and the insurance didn't cover much of it. I was forced to dip into my savings, but even that wasn't enough. I had reached a point where I could no longer pretend everything was okay. It was then that I decided to ask for help. I had never been one to ask for anything. I was the fixer, the problem solver, the one people came to when they needed something. But this time, I couldn't do it alone. The weight of the bills, the exhaustion from the treatments, and the constant pressure of managing everything had become too much. I needed support. I remember the day clearly. I had asked my sister to sit down with me in the living room. I told her about my situation, the mounting bills, the need for financial assistance, and how I was struggling to keep up. I didn't ask for much, just a small contribution to help cover some of the costs. I even reassured her that it didn't have to be a permanent arrangement, just a temporary gesture to get me through this rough patch. I thought she would understand, that she would see the need, and offer whatever help she could. But instead of the sympathy I had expected, I was met with silence. My sister looked at me, her face unreadable. For a long moment, I thought maybe she hadn't understood me. But when she spoke, her words hit me like a punch to the stomach. "You know, we've been living here for 5 years," she said, her voice calm but firm. "And we've never asked for anything. We've done what we could to help around the house, but we're not in a position to give you money." Her words were a blur as they echoed in my mind. They weren't the words I had expected to hear. This was my sister, the woman I had given so much to, the person I had supported through thick and thin. How could she not see how much I needed her now? How could she not recognize that after everything I had done for her family, I needed something in return? "I'm sorry," she continued, as if the apology were supposed to make everything better. "We're barely getting by as it is. I don't have anything to give." I stood there stunned. It wasn't the refusal that hurt the most. It was the way she had said it, like my struggle was a burden she wasn't willing to carry. Like I was the one asking for something too much, too selfish. And that's when I realized the truth. All these years, I had been carrying the weight of our family's needs without expecting anything in return. But when it came time for me to ask for a little support, the scales had tipped. She didn't see me as someone who needed help, just someone who always gave it. The realization hit me hard. I had spent so many years being the one to make things work, to be the backbone of our family, but when it came to me needing something, anything, there was nothing left. The days that followed my conversation with my sister were a blur, a mix of anger, hurt, and disbelief. For the first time in 5 years, I felt like an outsider in my own home, and that feeling didn't dissipate as quickly as I had hoped. Every time I walked through the house, the silence was deafening. The laughter of the children no longer seemed innocent. It felt like a reminder of everything I had sacrificed and how little it had mattered. I had given them a place to stay, and in return, I had hoped for understanding, compassion, and maybe just a small gesture of help when I needed it most. But now, everything felt broken. I couldn't even look at my sister the same way anymore. Every conversation, every interaction, was filled with a tension I couldn't ignore. Even the smallest exchanges felt loaded, as though there were things left unsaid, but known to both of us. I tried to push it out of my mind, to focus on my health and the mounting medical bills that seemed to multiply every day, but it was hard. The truth was, I had been avoiding the reality of what was happening. For years, I had focused on the people around me, taking care of them, making sure their needs were met, but when the time came for me to ask for help, it was clear that I was invisible to them. My sister's refusal to help me made me realize that she had never really seen me as an equal, but as a source of support. And that revelation cut deeper than I could have imagined. The pressure to figure out how I was going to handle my medical bills was mounting. I had already borrowed money from friends, sold a few things, and even taken out a small loan, but none of it was enough. I was getting sicker. The exhaustion from the treatments was wearing me down, and the constant stress of financial uncertainty only made it worse. And yet, in the midst of it all, I couldn't bring myself to ask anyone else for help. It wasn't just about pride, it was about what I had been taught growing up. Family was supposed to be the one thing you could count on, and now that was being stripped away from me. The breaking point came 1 week later. I had just returned from a particularly difficult doctor's appointment where I'd been informed that my condition was worsening. The thought of having to go through another round of treatments, not knowing how I was going to pay for it, made me feel like I was drowning. I had reached the limit of what I could handle. I couldn't do this alone anymore. I tried talking to my sister again. This time, I was desperate. I wasn't asking for a handout. I was asking for a little help, something to get me through this. I waited for the right moment when the kids were out of the house, and I pulled her aside in the kitchen. She was making dinner, her back to me, but I could see the tension in her shoulders. "I need you to understand something," I said, my voice trembling with the weight of everything I had been holding in. "I'm not asking for a miracle. I'm not asking for you to pay everything. But I can't keep doing this alone. I need help, just a little bit." "It's not too much to ask, is it?" She didn't turn around at first, but when she finally did, her face was unreadable. She sighed, running a hand through her hair, and I saw the familiar hesitation in her eyes. For a moment, I thought maybe this time she would understand. Maybe she would see how dire things were and offer some form of support. "I told you before, I can't," she said, her voice steady but cold. "We're barely making ends meet. How am I supposed to help you when we're struggling too?" My heart sank. It wasn't the first time she had said this, but something about her tone this time felt final. She wasn't even trying to understand. I felt myself growing angrier, the hurt turning into resentment. "You've been living here rent-free for 5 years," I said, the words escaping before I could stop them. "And now, when I ask for help, you can't even offer a little support? You've used me for so long, and now that I need something, you turn your back on me." I immediately regretted the words as they left my mouth. It was cruel, but it felt like the truth. I had been silent for so long, and now the dam had broken. But the look on her face was more than I could bear. She didn't look angry. She looked tired. She shook her head, as though she couldn't comprehend what I was saying. "You don't get it, do you?" she asked softly. "You're always the one who takes care of everything. You've always been the one who's strong, who fixes things. You never need anything from me. And now that you do, it's like I'm the one who's wrong for not helping. You don't understand how hard it is for us either. We're just trying to survive." Her words hung in the air between us, heavy with meaning. She was right about one thing. I had always been the one to take care of things. I had always been the strong one, the one everyone could rely on. But that wasn't the issue. The issue was that when the roles were reversed, when I needed someone to lean on, there was no one there. "I get it," I said, my voice barely above a whisper. "But I don't think you understand what it's like to feel invisible. To always give, but never receive. I've been carrying the weight of this family for years, and now I'm asking for a little help. Is that really too much to ask?" She didn't answer. Instead, she turned away from me, her face pinched in frustration. She muttered something about having too much on her plate and left the kitchen, leaving me standing there, feeling more alone than ever. The following days were strained. We barely spoke, and when we did, it was through gritted teeth. Every interaction felt like a reminder of everything I had sacrificed and how little it had been appreciated. My health continued to deteriorate, and the bills continued to pile up. I was sinking, but no one seemed to notice. Then, as if things couldn't get worse, my sister's husband, who had been mostly absent from the discussions, finally entered the picture. He had been quiet up until now, but his sudden involvement felt like the final straw. One evening, he sat me down and, with a tone that was both dismissive and condescending, tried to convince me that I was asking for too much. He said my situation wasn't their responsibility, that they had their own problems to deal with, and that I should figure it out on my own. Something inside me snapped. I realized then that the generosity I had extended to them all these years had only ever been a one-way street. The weight of it all, the years of giving without receiving, the constant feeling of being taken for granted, finally became too much to bear. I walked out of the room, not knowing if I would ever feel the same way about my family again. The conflict wasn't just about the money anymore. It was about the realization that the people I had always trusted had never really seen me. They had never truly seen me as an equal, as someone worthy of support. I had given everything, and in return, I had gotten nothing but silence and rejection. The emotional toll was heavier than the financial one. It was late one evening when everything came to a head. The house was quieter than usual, too quiet if I'm being honest. The kids had gone to bed early, and my sister was in her room, as she had been for most of the evening. Her husband was watching TV in the living room, and I found myself staring at the stack of medical bills on the kitchen counter. The silence was deafening, pressing down on me like a weight I couldn't escape. I had spent days, no, weeks, avoiding this moment. The confrontation that was inevitable. I had tried to reason with my sister, tried to make her understand. I had even made excuses for her, convinced myself that maybe she had her own struggles, that maybe she couldn't help because of things I couldn't see. But the truth was, I had been putting my own needs aside for so long, waiting for a moment of clarity, waiting for the right words to come. But I had nothing left. No more patience. No more excuses. It was time for me to confront the reality of what had been building for years. I walked into the living room, where my brother-in-law was slouched on the couch, his eyes glued to the screen. My heart pounded in my chest. I wasn't sure if I was scared, angry, or just exhausted from pretending everything was okay. "I need to talk to you," I said, my voice trembling but firm. He barely glanced at me before muttering something about needing a break from the TV, but I didn't care. I was past caring. "No, now," I repeated, my voice cutting through the noise of the room. I was done with the silence. Done with the pretense. This needed to happen, whether he was ready for it or not. He sighed and put the remote down, turning his full attention to me, his expression unreadable. "What's this about?" he asked, sounding more annoyed than concerned. But I wasn't going to be deterred. This had gone on long enough. "I'm tired," I said, my voice breaking as the weight of everything I had been holding in came crashing down on me. "I'm tired of being the one who does everything. I'm tired of being the one who always gives, who always sacrifices, who always puts others first. And when I need something, when I ask for a little bit of help, all I get is silence. I've spent 5 years taking care of you all, and now I'm asking for a little bit of support, and I get nothing." His eyes narrowed, and I could see the frustration building in his face. "We've been living here rent-free for years, and now you want us to pay for your medical bills? Do you even understand how ridiculous that sounds?" Those words hit me like a slap in the face. I felt my heart drop into my stomach as anger flared inside me. It wasn't just about the money, it was the fact that I had been asking for help, for compassion, and all he could do was dismiss me. He didn't even see me as a person, as a sister or a family member. I was just another thing for him to get annoyed about. "No," I said, my voice shaking but stronger now. "What's ridiculous is that you think I'm asking for something that I haven't already earned. I gave you a place to live for 5 years, I took care of everything, I helped with the kids, I did all of the things you didn't want to do. And now, when I'm asking for something, you can't even see that? You can't even acknowledge that I need help too? You've been living off my generosity, and now you act like I'm asking for too much." He opened his mouth to respond, but I cut him off before he could speak. "I'm not asking for everything. I'm not asking for you to fix everything. But what I'm asking for is some recognition. Some understanding. Some acknowledgement that I've been here for you, for all of you. And now, when the tables are turned, you can't even give me the basic decency of caring." He didn't say anything for a moment, just sat there, looking at me like he didn't even know who I was. I didn't expect him to suddenly get it, to suddenly apologize. But I needed to say it. I needed to say the words that had been building up inside me for so long. I needed to feel like I mattered. "Do you think it's easy for me to ask you for help?" I continued, my voice softening now, but still filled with raw emotion. "Do you think it's easy to admit that I'm struggling? I've never asked for anything. I've never needed anything from anyone. But I can't do this on my own anymore. And when I ask, when I'm vulnerable, all I get is rejection. All I get is the feeling that I'm nothing more than an obligation to you." The silence between us grew thick, and I could see the realization dawning on his face. He didn't speak right away, and for a moment, I thought maybe he was going to come to his senses. Maybe he would apologize. Maybe he would finally see me. But then he stood up and walked toward the door, muttering something about needing a break from the drama. "I can't do this anymore," he said over his shoulder, his voice cold and indifferent. "I've got my own problems." And just like that, the last piece of the illusion shattered. He walked out the door, leaving me standing in the living room alone. The anger was gone now, replaced with a deep, aching sadness. This wasn't about the money anymore. It was about the fact that no one had ever really seen me. I had given everything, and in return, I had nothing but empty words and broken promises. I turned to walk toward the kitchen, my legs shaky and weak. I didn't know what I expected, maybe an apology, maybe some kind of acknowledgement that I wasn't just a tool to be used. But I didn't get that. What I got was the cold reality of my own loneliness. I had spent so many years trying to hold everything together, trying to make everyone else's life better, that I had forgotten to take care of myself. And now I was left with nothing but the weight of my own broken heart. I sat down at the kitchen table, staring at the pile of bills in front of me. I had given so much, and now I was left with the consequences of my own sacrifices. I had hoped that asking for help would make things right, but all it had done was expose the truth. I was on my own. I was alone. And in that moment, I realized that I had to figure out how to fix it myself. The days after that night were a blur of raw emotion. I didn't cry, at least, not at first, but I felt numb, disconnected from everything around me. I had always prided myself on being self-sufficient, on being the one others turned to for support. But in that moment, I realized how fragile that facade had been. All of my efforts to hold everything together had been in vain, and I was left to pick up the pieces of my own shattered heart. I avoided my sister for days after that confrontation. She had tried to talk to me, to apologize, but I couldn't bring myself to face her. The anger was still too fresh, and the wound she had created was too deep. I wasn't ready to forgive her, not yet. But I also wasn't ready to lose her. Family was supposed to be a bond that couldn't be broken, right? But now, it felt like I was standing on the edge of an abyss, unsure of how to bridge the gap between us. It wasn't until a week later that I finally reached out. My health was continuing to decline, and the medical bills were starting to feel insurmountable. I couldn't keep pretending like everything was fine. I needed help, and I needed to find a way to reconcile with my sister, if it was even possible. I called her that afternoon, my hands shaking as I held the phone to my ear. "I'm sorry," I said when she picked up. My voice was barely above a whisper, but the words felt like they carried the weight of everything I had been holding in. "I don't want to keep avoiding you. I don't want this to be the end of our relationship. But I can't pretend like nothing happened. You hurt me, and I don't know how to deal with that." There was a long pause on the other end of the line before she responded, her voice soft. "I know. And I'm sorry. I didn't mean to hurt you. I don't know. I was overwhelmed. But I see now how much I've taken you for granted. I've been selfish, and I'm sorry for that." I could feel the sincerity in her words, but the pain of everything that had transpired between us couldn't be undone with a simple apology. Still, it was a start. It was a small glimmer of hope in the midst of everything else. We talked for a while after that, not just about what had happened, but about everything, the things we had been too afraid to say to each other, the resentment that had built up over the years, the hurt we had both been hiding. It wasn't easy. It wasn't a perfect resolution, and I knew things couldn't go back to the way they were before. But for the first time in weeks, I felt like there was a chance for healing. I had always believed that family would always be there for you, that no matter what happened, there was always a way back. It wasn't that simple, but I was beginning to realize that relationships weren't static. They evolved, sometimes in painful ways, but they could evolve in ways that led to healing too. A few days later, my sister came over to the house. She brought with her an envelope, and for the first time since everything had gone downhill, she didn't look at me like I was a burden. She looked at me like she actually saw me, like she understood, even if she hadn't fully grasped how much I had been carrying. "I know it's not enough," she said, handing me the envelope. "But I want to help. I'm sorry for everything. And I'm going to do better." I opened the envelope, and inside was a check, a significant one that could make a difference. It wasn't the entire amount I needed, but it was something. It was a gesture of understanding, of acknowledgement, and in that moment, it meant more than any apology could. It showed me that she was finally seeing me, really seeing me, not just as the person who always gave, but as someone who also needed help, who also deserved support. "I didn't expect this," I said, my voice cracking as I looked up at her. "But thank you. This means more to me than you know." She smiled softly, her eyes filled with regret, but also with a glimmer of hope. "I know I failed you in so many ways, but I want to make things right. I'm not perfect, but I'll do better." That night, we sat together in the kitchen, talking like we hadn't in so long. It wasn't a perfect moment, and I wasn't sure if I could ever forget the hurt that had built up between us. But I knew this. We had taken the first step toward healing. We weren't there yet, but we were getting there. The following weeks were still difficult. My health was still a concern, and the bills continued to pile up. But there was a sense of relief, knowing that I didn't have to carry this burden alone anymore. My sister, while imperfect, had stepped up in a way I hadn't expected. She had finally acknowledged the weight of what I had been carrying, and even though I didn't have all the answers, I felt like I could breathe again. And as for me, I realized something crucial in the process. I had spent so much time focusing on the needs of others, so much time trying to make everything perfect for everyone else, that I had forgotten to take care of myself. I had forgotten that it was okay to ask for help, to lean on those who loved me, to be vulnerable. I was still learning that it wasn't a weakness to need others, it was a part of being human. As the weeks passed, I found myself slowly recovering, not just physically, but emotionally. The healing process was slow, but it was happening. My sister and I were rebuilding our relationship, brick by brick. We weren't perfect, but we were trying, and that was enough. The road ahead wasn't clear, but for the first time in a long while, I felt hopeful. I had learned something important, that no matter how strong you are, no matter how much you give, it's okay to need others. And sometimes, asking for help is the bravest thing you can do. As I sat in the quiet of my living room that evening, watching the flicker of the lamp light across the room, I reflected on everything that had happened. It felt like a lifetime ago when I first opened my doors to my sister's family, when the idea of offering them refuge had seemed like the right thing to do. I had spent years pouring my heart and soul into supporting them, only to realize that somewhere along the way, I had forgotten to care for myself. I had spent so much time building a life for others that I neglected to make room for my own needs, and in doing so, I had let the resentment build in silence. But now, looking back, I realized that this journey had taught me something profound. In trying to be the strong one, the one who could fix everything, I had closed myself off from the very thing that made relationships real: vulnerability. It was the act of opening up, of finally acknowledging my own pain and my need for support, that had begun to heal the rift between my sister and me. Our relationship wasn't perfect, and it may never be exactly as it once was, but I had learned that family isn't about perfection. It's about understanding, forgiveness, and learning how to give and receive love in equal measure. I had started this chapter of my life thinking I was doing the right thing by carrying everything on my own. But I ended it with the realization that asking for help doesn't make you weak, it makes you human. I had let go of the idea that I had to be invincible, and in doing so, I had found my own strength. The road ahead wasn't going to be easy, but as I stood up from the couch, a small sense of peace washed over me. I had taken the first step toward healing, not just for my body, but for my heart. And as I looked out the window at the soft glow of the streetlights, I felt a quiet sense of hope. Maybe, just maybe, things could get better. Maybe, just maybe, there was a way forward.